Hey guys, tonight we begin with ancient baby barbecues. And no, that's not a typo or a particularly dark cooking show. We're diving into one of history's most controversial practices that would make even the most hardcore helicopter parent clutch their organic, gluten-free pearls. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And honestly, if you stick around for this topic, you might need therapy more than a subscription. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world, especially for a bedtime story about ancient child sacrifice. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background, And let's ease into tonight's journey together into one of humanity's darker chapters. Let's start with the biggest misconception about Carthaginian child sacrifice. Most people picture some primitive, bloodthirsty savages throwing babies into fires like they're disposing of yesterday's leftovers. In reality, this was an elaborate, deeply religious ceremony performed by one of the ancient world's most sophisticated civilizations. Think less cavemen with torches and more ancient accountants with very disturbing religious portfolios. This wasn't some spontaneous barbarian rage fest. It was a carefully orchestrated ritual called the Moloch sacrifice, complete with priests, ceremonies, and what can only be described as the world's most horrifying religious real estate. The Carthaginians weren't wild-eyed fanatics. They were successful merchants, brilliant naval commanders, and skilled diplomats who happened to believe that occasionally roasting their offspring was good business practice with the gods. It's like finding out your friendly neighborhood CPA moonlights as a vampire. Disturbing, but oddly organized. The 8th to 2nd centuries BCE was when Carthage ruled the Mediterranean like an ancient maritime mafia. Modern-day Tunisia wasn't some backwater desert outpost. It was the New York City of the ancient world, complete with towering buildings, bustling harbors, and apparently designated baby-burning districts. The Carthaginian Empire controlled trade routes like Amazon controls your online shopping habits, and their influence stretched from Spain to the borders of Egypt. If you thought ancient life was all togas and philosophical debates, think again. It was cutthroat capitalism with a side of ritual infanticide. The Carthaginians were essentially the Phoenicians' greatest hits album, having originated as a Phoenician colony that grew up to become more successful than its parents. Kind of like that kid who moves out and immediately starts making more money than their folks. Except instead of rubbing it in at family dinners, they built an empire. They worshipped a pantheon of gods that made the Greek deities look like a wholesome sitcom family. Their main gods, Moloch and Tanit, apparently had very specific dietary requirements that would make modern food critics weep. The city itself was a marvel of engineering and urban planning, with sophisticated harbor systems, multi-story buildings, and residential districts that would make ancient Romans jealous. But hidden among these achievements were the Tophets, sacred burial grounds that archaeologists would later discover contained the charred remains of thousands of children, neatly arranged in urns like the world's most disturbing archaeological filing system. Enter our first major character, not a person, but a place that would make Stephen King relocate to somewhere cheerier. The Tophet of Carthage was discovered in 1921 by archaeologists who probably wished they'd chosen a different career path. Picture this. You're excavating what you think is a normal ancient cemetery, and instead you find row upon row of ceramic urns containing the cremated remains of infants and children, many under the age of 2. It's like opening what you think is a cookie jar and finding, well, definitely not cookies. But here's where it gets even more twisted. These weren't random burials. Each urn was carefully labeled with inscriptions that read like the world's most disturbing thank you notes. To Lord Moloch, a gift. Some inscriptions even specified that the child was sacrificed in thanks for answered prayers, like ancient Yelp reviews written in infant ashes. One particularly chilling inscription allegedly read something equivalent to thanks for the good harvest. Here's my firstborn, making it the most extreme example of gratitude in human history. The discovery revealed over 20,000 urns spanning several centuries, suggesting this wasn't some rare, desperate practice during times of crisis, but rather standard operating procedure for Carthaginian religious life. Modern parents stress about screen time and organic vegetables. Carthaginian parents had to budget for potential child sacrifice like it was a particularly morbid college fund. And if you think that's disturbing, wait until you hear about the specific ceremonies involved, because apparently, simply killing children wasn't elaborate enough. They had to turn it into a whole production. This wasn't just about religious extremism run amok. Child sacrifice in Carthage was deeply intertwined with social status, political power, and economic success. Basically, it was the ultimate keeping up with the Joneses situation, except the Joneses were sacrificing their children to maintain their social standing. Wealthy families allegedly competed to offer the most valuable sacrifices, turning child murder into a twisted status symbol that would make modern social media influencers seem positively wholesome by comparison. The practice affected every level of Carthaginian society, from wealthy merchants trying to secure favorable trade wins to politicians seeking divine endorsement for their policies. It created a culture where parental love had to compete with religious obligation and social pressure. Imagine having to choose between loving your child and maintaining your place in society, except the stakes were literally life and death. This system perpetuated itself for centuries, becoming so normalized that questioning it was probably more shocking than participating in it. But the Tophet discoveries were just the tip of the iceberg. The archaeological evidence painted a picture of systematic, organized child sacrifice that made other ancient practices look like gentle bedtime stories. The specific rituals, the social pressures, and the sheer scale of the operation revealed a civilization with some seriously twisted priorities. The ritual mechanics of Carthaginian child sacrifice weren't your typical throw the baby and hope for the best approach. Oh no, these people had turned infanticide into an art form that would make modern event planners weep with either admiration or horror. Unlike the common assumption that ancient sacrifices were chaotic, blood-soaked affairs conducted by wild-eyed fanatics, Carthaginian Moloch ceremonies were meticulously planned events with more protocols than a modern corporate merger. The historical context for this specific aspect of their culture reveals a society that has systematized the most horrific act imaginable. The practice developed alongside Carthage's rise to power, becoming more elaborate and institutionalized as the empire grew wealthier and more sophisticated. It's like watching a startup evolve into a Fortune 500 company, except instead of developing better customer service, they perfected child murder. The ceremonies were conducted in specially designated areas within the Tophet, complete with stone altars, bronze braziers, and what can only be described as ancient religious infrastructure specifically designed for burning babies. Archaeological evidence suggests these weren't makeshift affairs. They were permanent installations that required ongoing maintenance, religious staff, and what must have been the world's most disturbing job descriptions. Imagine being the ancient equivalent of a facilities manager for a child sacrifice compound, looking for a challenging career opportunity in religious services. Must be comfortable with fire, screaming, and existential dread. The development of such elaborate systems suggests this wasn't a practice born of desperation or crisis, but rather a calculated religious investment strategy. The Carthaginians believed they were making deposits in a divine bank account, with children as currency and favor from the gods as the expected return on investment. It's venture capitalism with a body count, and apparently, business was booming. Take the case of what archaeologists call Burial Area 7, a section of the Carthage Tophet that contains some of the most disturbing evidence of systematic child sacrifice. The remains found here weren't just randomly disposed of. They were arranged with the kind of organizational precision that would make a German filing system look chaotic. Each ceramic urn was carefully labeled, dated, and positioned according to specific protocols that reveal a bureaucracy of death that operated for centuries. One particularly well-preserved inscription, roughly translated, reads, "To Lord Moloch, a life for a life, a soul for a soul." Hamilcar offers his son, his firstborn, in payment of his vow. This wasn't some desperate plea during a crisis. It was a thank you note for services rendered, like leaving a 5-star review for your divine customer service experience. Except instead of praising the speedy delivery, you're thanking the gods for answering your prayers by barbecuing your baby. Another discovery involved what appeared to be a mass sacrifice event, where multiple families simultaneously offered children during what was likely a major religious festival. The archaeological evidence suggests this was a coordinated community effort. Imagine a neighborhood block party where instead of bringing potato salad, everyone brings their firstborn. The remains show evidence of careful preparation, with some children apparently drugged or sedated before the sacrifice, suggesting even in their most horrific moments, the Carthaginians maintained their reputation for efficient planning. One haunting example involved the burial of twin infants, found in a specially decorated urn with an inscription, indicating they were offered together as a complete gift to ensure the success of a major trading expedition. The twins' remains showed no signs of struggle, suggesting they were killed quickly and efficiently, a small mercy in an otherwise unthinkable act. The successful return of the trading expedition was apparently documented elsewhere, leading to the disturbing implication that from the family's perspective, the sacrifice worked exactly as intended. The Tophets also revealed evidence of substitute sacrifices, where families who couldn't afford to sacrifice their own children would offer lambs or other animals instead, creating what was essentially a religious layaway plan for child murder. Wealthy families, not to be outdone, would sometimes sacrifice multiple children or offer particularly elaborate ceremonies, turning infanticide into a twisted form of conspicuous consumption. It's like keeping up with the Kardashians, except instead of plastic surgery and expensive handbags, the status symbols were dead children and ornate funeral urns. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the discovery of what appeared to be repeat customers, families whose names appeared on multiple urns over several years, suggesting they had sacrificed multiple children. One family's inscription spanned nearly 2 decades, indicating they had essentially adopted child sacrifice as a regular religious practice, like tithing, but infinitely more horrific. The casual tone of later inscriptions from the same families suggests they had become desensitized to what they were doing, treating child sacrifice like a routine religious obligation rather than the earth-shattering tragedy it represented. But it wasn't that simple, because nothing in ancient history ever is. And Carthaginian child sacrifice was complicated in ways that would make a philosophy professor's head spin. The complicating factors begin with the most obvious question. How does a sophisticated civilization rationalize systematically murdering its own children? The answer reveals contradictions that challenge our understanding of how ancient societies function. First, there's contradictory evidence about who was actually being sacrificed. While some inscriptions clearly indicate biological children of the families making the offerings, others suggest the use of slaves, adopted children, or even children purchased specifically for sacrifice. This created a twisted marketplace where Human lives became commodities in a religious economy. Imagine if Amazon had a babies for sacrifice category, complete with customer reviews and bulk pricing. Different perspectives emerge when you consider that not all Carthaginians participated in or supported these practices. Some evidence suggests there were voices of dissent, though they were apparently either ignored or silenced. Roman sources, admittedly biased, claimed that some Carthaginian families fled the city rather than participate in mass sacrifice events. However, these accounts come from Romans who practiced their own forms of ritualized violence, making their moral outrage somewhat hypocritical. It's like serial killers criticizing each other's methods. The situation was more complex than it appears because child sacrifice existed alongside genuine expressions of parental love and family devotion. Archaeological evidence from Carthaginian homes shows toys, games, and evidence of childhood activities that suggest children were valued and cared for in daily life. This creates a cognitive dissonance that's difficult to reconcile. How do you lovingly raise a child while simultaneously planning their potential sacrifice? It's like being both a helicopter parent and a homicidal maniac, which is either the most extreme form of compartmentalization in human history or evidence that we still don't fully understand how these practices functioned within Carthaginian society. Modern analogies help explain this complexity. Consider how modern societies rationalize practices that future generations might find horrific. We simultaneously love animals and systematically slaughter them for food, wage wars while preaching peace, and destroy the environment while knowing it threatens our children's future. The Carthaginians might have viewed child sacrifice similarly, as a necessary evil for the greater good, or as a religious obligation that transcended personal feelings. The result was a society living with a fundamental contradiction that would make modern psychologists rich if they could travel back in time. The psychological consequences of normalizing child sacrifice created a culture where parents had to navigate the impossible tension between natural parental instincts and religious obligations. Imagine trying to bond with your newborn while simultaneously calculating their potential value as a divine offering. It's like trying to enjoy a meal while wondering if it might be poisoned. The institutional reactions were perhaps even more disturbing than the individual ones. Rather than questioning the practice, Carthaginian religious and political leaders refined and systematized it, creating an entire bureaucracy dedicated to child sacrifice that operated with the efficiency of a modern corporation. They developed quality control measures, standardized procedures, and even what appeared to be training programs for priests, turning the murder of children into a professional service industry. The social consequences rippled through every aspect of Carthaginian life. Families had to plan for the possibility of sacrificing children like modern parents plan for college expenses, except infinitely more horrific. This created a culture where having multiple children wasn't just about ensuring lineage or having extra farmhands. It was about maintaining a reserve of potential sacrificial offerings. Large families became both a blessing and a terrifying responsibility. The long-term implications affected Carthaginian society in ways that historians are still debating. Some argue that the practice created a culture of violence that made Carthaginians more effective warriors, while others suggest it created psychological trauma that weakened social bonds. The truth probably lies somewhere in between, but the fact that the practice continued for centuries suggests that whatever consequences it had, they weren't severe enough to stop it. International reactions were mixed and often hypocritical. The Romans, who would later use child sacrifice as propaganda to justify their destruction of Carthage, practiced their own forms of ritualized violence and infanticide. The Greeks, despite their philosophical sophistication, also engaged in practices that modern societies would consider barbaric. It's like a group of cannibals criticizing each other's cooking methods, technically accurate, but missing the bigger picture. Perhaps most tragically, the consequences extended beyond the immediate victims to create a society where the unthinkable became routine, where love and murder coexisted in the same families, and where religious devotion was measured in the blood of innocents. Meanwhile, the archaeological evidence reveals that child sacrifice was just one aspect of a broader religious system that permeated every aspect of Carthaginian life. The connection between the previous horrific practices and the elaborate religious infrastructure that supported them becomes clear when you examine the broader context of how these ceremonies functioned within Carthaginian society. The Tophet wasn't just a cemetery or a sacrifice site. It was the centerpiece of a religious complex that included temples, priest quarters, and administrative buildings that managed what was essentially a death cult, masquerading as mainstream. Religion. The religious system that enabled child sacrifice also created a complex social hierarchy based on religious participation, where your standing in the community was partially determined by your willingness to make the ultimate sacrifice. This wasn't just about faith. It was about power, politics, and social control wrapped in religious ceremony. The same priests who oversaw child sacrifices also managed trade negotiations, political alliances, and military campaigns, creating a theocracy where religious extremism and practical governance became indistinguishable. Building anticipation for the next section, we'll explore how this religious system expanded beyond child sacrifice to encompass every aspect of Carthaginian life, creating a society where the sacred and the profane became so intertwined that separating them became impossible. The rituals, the politics, and the social structures all fed into a system that would eventually contribute to Carthage's downfall in ways that would have surprised even the Romans. If the ritual mechanics of child sacrifice were the horrifying main course of Carthaginian religious practice, then the social engineering aspects were the equally disturbing appetizer that prepared society to accept the unacceptable. While the previous theme explored how they killed children, this new angle examines how they convinced an entire civilization that killing children was not only acceptable, but actually a good idea, which is like convincing people that root canals are a fun weekend activity, except infinitely more sinister. The context for this social conditioning reveals a sophisticated propaganda machine that would make modern political spin doctors weep with envy. The Carthaginians didn't just stumble into child sacrifice. They systematically constructed a belief system that made infanticide seem not only reasonable, but morally imperative. It's like watching a masterclass in psychological manipulation. Except instead of selling timeshares or pyramid schemes, they were selling the idea that barbecuing babies was a sound investment strategy. This social engineering became important because you can't maintain a practice as extreme as systematic child sacrifice without creating powerful psychological and social mechanisms to support it. The Carthaginians developed what can only be described as a comprehensive indoctrination program that started in childhood and continued throughout life, ensuring that each generation was properly prepared to either sacrifice their children or watch their neighbors do it without batting an eye. The religious infrastructure supported this, conditioning through elaborate ceremonies, storytelling traditions, and educational systems that normalized the abnormal. Children grew up hearing stories about the great benefits of sacrifice, watching ceremonial preparations, and learning that their potential death was actually a privilege rather than a tragedy. It's like a twisted version of Sunday school where, instead of learning about love and compassion, kids learned about the proper etiquette for being burned alive for religious purposes. The fact that this system functioned for centuries suggests it was remarkably effective at what it was designed to do, which is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of all. Consider the case of what historians called Great Sacrifice of 310 BCE, an event that demonstrates how social pressure and religious manipulation combined to create mass participation in child murder. According to historical accounts, Carthage was facing military pressure from the Sicilian Greeks and the cities. Leaders decided that the gods were angry because the quality of recent sacrifices had declined. Apparently, too many wealthy families had been cheating by substituting slave children for their own biological offspring, which is like being caught using generic brands instead of name brands. Except the stakes were literally life and death. The response was a citywide campaign to restore proper sacrifice standards that would make modern quality control initiatives look like gentle suggestions. The religious authorities, backed by political leaders, launched what can only be described as a child sacrifice drive that targeted the city's most prominent families. It wasn't enough to sacrifice random children. The gods allegedly demanded the biological offspring of the wealthy and powerful, creating a situation where social status became inversely related to your children's life expectancy. The key players in this horrific drama included the high priest of Moloch, who acted as both religious authorities and public relations specialists, convincing families that sacrificing their children was actually a privilege and an honor. They developed elaborate theological arguments about why the gods preferred the blood of the wealthy, turning class warfare into religious doctrine. Political leaders supported the campaign by suggesting that families who refused to participate were unpatriotic and potentially treasonous, because nothing says civic duty like murdering your own children. The drama and conflict arose when some families attempted to resist or flee the city rather than participate. Historical accounts describe desperate parents trying to hide their children, bribe officials, or even commit suicide rather than watch their offspring burn. However, social pressure and fear of being branded as religious traitors eventually forced most families to comply. The conflict resolution, if you can call it that, involved approximately 200 children from Carthage's most prominent families being sacrificed in a single ceremony that lasted several days. What makes this story particularly chilling is how the community rallied around the event. Instead of horror or revulsion, the mass sacrifice was treated as a religious festival complete with music, food vendors, and what can only be described as the world's most disturbing block party. Families who had just watched their children burn alive were congratulated for their piety and devotion, while those who had initially resisted were welcomed back into the community fold once they had demonstrated their commitment by participating in infanticide. The human elements of this story are almost too painful to contemplate. Parents had to maintain composure while watching their children die, pretending that this was a joyous religious celebration rather than the most traumatic experience imaginable. Children old enough to understand what was happening had to process the fact that their parents, the people they trusted most in the world, were actively participating in their murder. The psychological trauma must have been indescribable, yet the social system was so powerful that questioning it was apparently more terrifying than participating in it. The broader significance of the great sacrifice extends beyond its immediate horror to reveal how totalitarian religious systems can manipulate entire populations into committing atrocities. The event demonstrated that with sufficient social pressure, religious justification, and fear of ostracism, people will commit acts that would normally be unthinkable. It's a case study in how ordinary people become complicit in extraordinary evil, which unfortunately has relevance far beyond ancient Carthage. Perhaps most disturbing of all is that the great sacrifice was considered a success by contemporary standards. The military pressures that had prompted the mass sacrifice eventually eased, which the Carthaginians interpreted as proof that their horrific campaign had worked. This perceived success reinforced the entire system, making future mass sacrifices more likely rather than less. Success bred success, creating a positive feedback loop of infanticide that would continue for generations. This wasn't an isolated incident of religious extremism gone wrong. It was part of a recurring pattern that reveals how Carthaginian society had systematically normalized mass child murder through sophisticated social engineering techniques. Other examples from different time periods show similar dynamics. Military threats leading to religious panic, which led to increased sacrifice demands, which led to community-wide participation in infanticide, which led to perceived divine favor. When problems eventually resolve themselves, the pattern explanation reveals a cyclical system where external pressures triggered internal violence, which then created psychological relief through the illusion of control. When Carthaginians faced problems they couldn't solve through normal means, military defeats, economic downturns, natural disasters, they turned to child sacrifice as a way of feeling like they were taking meaningful action. It's like stress eating, except instead of consuming food, they consumed their own children. Why this pattern existed can be traced to several social, political, and economic factors that created the perfect storm for institutionalized infanticide. Politically, child sacrifice served as a way for leaders to demonstrate their commitment to the community, while simultaneously eliminating potential rivals. After all, dead children can't grow up to challenge the existing power structure. Economically, the practice created a religious economy where priests and temple officials gained wealth and influence through managing the sacrifice infrastructure. Socially, the pattern provided a release valve for community tensions and anxieties. When people felt powerless in the face of external threats, participating in child sacrifice gave them a sense of agency and control, even though the control was entirely illusory. It's psychological manipulation disguised as religious empowerment, creating a sense of community solidarity through shared participation in atrocity. Comparison to other time periods and places reveals that while child sacrifice itself was relatively rare in the ancient world, the social mechanisms that enabled it were depressingly common. The Romans practiced infanticide through exposure. The Greeks abandoned unwanted children to die, and numerous other civilizations found ways to systematically eliminate inconvenient members of their population. What made Carthage unique wasn't the violence itself, but the elaborate religious and social systems they constructed to make the violence seem not only acceptable, but virtuous. The pattern also reveals how quickly social norms can shift when the right pressures are applied. Within a generation or two, practices that would have been unthinkable became routine, and questioning them became more dangerous than participating in them. This demonstrates the terrifying plasticity of human moral systems and suggests that, under the right circumstances, almost any society could develop similarly horrific practices. The effects of this systematic social conditioning were far-reaching and devastating in ways that extended far beyond immediate victims. The psychological impact on survivors, both parents who had sacrificed children and children who had witnessed sacrifices, created a society-wide trauma that influenced Carthaginian culture for generations. Parents who had participated in child sacrifice had to live with the knowledge that they had murdered their own offspring for religious reasons, creating a form of collective PTSD that would make modern therapists rich if they could travel back in time. Who benefited from this system reveals the cynical calculations behind the religious facade. The priestly class gained enormous wealth and political power through managing the sacrifice infrastructure, while political leaders used religious participation as a loyalty test that eliminated potential dissidents. Temple officials became some of the wealthiest people in Carthage, essentially running a protection racket where families paid with their children's lives to avoid divine punishment. It's organized crime disguised as organized religion, which is perhaps the most honest description of how the system actually functioned. Who suffered extended far beyond the immediate victims to include entire extended families and communities. Grandparents had to watch their grandchildren burn. Siblings had to live with survivor's guilt. And communities had to process the collective trauma of regularly murdering their most vulnerable members. The psychological damage rippled through generations, creating a culture where emotional detachment became a survival mechanism and genuine human connection became dangerous because it made sacrifice more painful. The unintended consequences included the development of a society that was simultaneously highly sophisticated and deeply damaged. Carthaginians became excellent at compartmentalization, able to conduct complex business negotiations while planning child sacrifices. But this same emotional detachment may have hindered their ability to form the kind of social bonds that could have helped them resist Roman conquest. When your society is built on the systematic murder of children, trust becomes a luxury you can't afford. How this shaped future developments is still debated by historians, but it's clear that the practice contributed to Carthage's eventual downfall. The Romans used Carthaginian child sacrifice as propaganda to justify their wars of conquest, and the internal trauma created by the practice may have weakened Carthaginian society's ability to resist external threats. When the Romans finally destroyed Carthage, they didn't just eliminate a military rival, they ended a civilization that had become so damaged by its own practices that it may have been doomed. Regardless of external pressures, modern parallels are uncomfortable but undeniable. Any society that systematically dehumanizes vulnerable populations, that uses religious or ideological justifications for violence, or that creates social pressure to participate in atrocities, risks developing similar patterns of normalized horror. Yet, even as this social engineering was creating a society capable of systematic child murder, the Carthaginians were also developing some of the ancient world's most sophisticated military, commercial, and technological innovations. The same civilization that had perfected the art of burning babies alive was simultaneously revolutionizing naval warfare, establishing trade networks that spanned continents, and developing urban planning techniques that wouldn't be matched for centuries. It's like discovering that your serial killer neighbor also happens to be a brilliant surgeon who volunteers at animal shelters. The cognitive dissonance is almost impossible to process. The transition to our next major element reveals how this contradiction played out in Carthaginian society's relationship with the wider Mediterranean world. While they were perfecting religious infanticide at home, they were also becoming indispensable trading partners, military allies, and cultural influences throughout the region. Other civilizations knew about Carthaginian child sacrifice, but continued to do business with them anyway, creating an international community that was willing to overlook mass child murder in exchange for access to Carthaginian goods and services. This sets up the peak drama of our story: how a civilization capable of such internal horror could simultaneously project power and influence across the ancient world, and how these contradictions would eventually contribute to conflicts that would shake the foundations of the Mediterranean world, and ultimately lead to one of history's most complete destructions of a major civilization. By the 3rd century BCE, the contradiction between Carthage's horrific religious practices and its position as a Mediterranean superpower had reached a breaking point that would make modern international relations look like a friendly neighborhood barbecue. The situation had become untenable. You can't maintain diplomatic relationships with civilizations while simultaneously running what amounts to an industrial-scale child murder operation, especially when your business partners start asking uncomfortable questions about all that screaming coming from your religious districts. The description of tensions reveals a powder keg of cultural, religious, and political conflicts that were bound to explode eventually. Carthage had become the ancient world's most successful contradiction. A civilization that could negotiate complex trade agreements in the morning and burn babies in the afternoon, all while maintaining the facade of being a respectable member of the international community. It's like trying to be a respected member of the PTA while running a side business in human trafficking. Eventually, someone's going to notice the inconsistency. The key players involved in this mounting crisis included not just the Carthaginians themselves, but their increasingly uncomfortable neighbors who had to decide whether access to Carthaginian purple dye and silver was worth overlooking systematic infanticide. The Romans, Greeks, Egyptians, and various other Mediterranean powers found themselves in the awkward position of condemning Carthaginian religious practices while simultaneously depending on Carthaginian trade networks for their economic survival. The stakes involved were nothing less than the future of Mediterranean civilization. Would the international community continue to tolerate a major power that practiced systematic child sacrifice? Or would moral outrage eventually override economic convenience? It's the ancient equivalent of modern debates about doing business with authoritarian regimes, except instead of just suppressing dissidents, the Carthaginians were literally barbecuing babies. The tension had been building for decades, with various diplomatic incidents, cultural exchanges gone wrong, and increasingly strained relationships that were about to explode into the most consequential conflict of the ancient world. The breaking point came during what historians call the diplomatic incident of 264 BCE. Though calling it an incident is like calling the Titanic disaster a minor navigation error. The event that would ultimately doom Carthage began not with a military confrontation, but with a cultural exchange that went so spectacularly wrong, it would have been hilarious if it hadn't involved the systematic murder of children. The buildup started when a Roman diplomatic mission arrived in Carthage to negotiate a new trade agreement, coinciding with one of Carthage's major religious festivals dedicated to Moloch. The Romans, who weren't exactly squeamish about violence themselves, were nonetheless unprepared for what they were about to witness. Imagine showing up to a business meeting and discovering your potential partners are in the middle of hosting what can only be described as a baby barbecue. It tends to put a damper on negotiations. The key moments unfolded like a horror movie disguised as a diplomatic reception. The Roman delegation, led by Senator Marcus Claudius Pulcher, arrived expecting the usual round of ceremonial banquets, gift exchanges, and tedious speeches about mutual cooperation. Instead, they found themselves seated as honored guests at what was essentially a child sacrifice festival, complete with entertainment, refreshments, and a front-row view of systematic infanticide. Contemporary accounts, though filtered through Roman bias, described the Romans' growing horror as they realized what they were witnessing. The Carthaginians, apparently oblivious to their guests' distress, treated the ceremony as a normal part of their hospitality package, like offering hotel guests complimentary breakfast, except instead of continental cuisine, they were serving up ritualized child murder. The Romans found themselves trapped by diplomatic protocol. Walking out would be an insult that could trigger a war, but staying meant tacitly endorsing practices that even their violence-accustomed sensibilities found revolting. The play-by-play of important scenes reads like a diplomatic nightmare fuel. The ceremony began with the usual pomp and circumstance, priests in elaborate robes, musicians playing ceremonial music, and what appeared to be a normal religious celebration. Then came the children, dressed in their finest clothes and apparently drugged to ensure compliance. The Roman delegation watched in mounting horror as Carthaginian families presented their offspring to the priests with what appeared to be genuine joy and religious fervor. Senator Pulcher's recorded comments, preserved in later Roman historical accounts, allegedly included the observation that these people celebrate the murder of their children with more enthusiasm than we celebrate our military victories. Another Roman delegate reportedly asked his Carthaginian host whether this was some sort of elaborate theatrical performance, only to be told cheerfully that no, this was absolutely real. And weren't the Romans honored to witness such a sacred ceremony? Character motivations reveal the impossibility of the situation. The Carthaginians genuinely believed they were honoring their Roman guests by including them in their most sacred religious observances. They couldn't understand why the Romans seemed distressed. After all, they were witnessing the ultimate expression of Carthaginian piety and devotion. The Romans, meanwhile, found themselves caught between diplomatic necessity and moral revulsion, trying to maintain polite facade, while watching something that challenged their understanding of civilized behavior. The unexpected developments came when some Roman delegates began openly weeping during the ceremony, which the Carthaginians interpreted as being moved by the profound spiritual significance of what they were witnessing. This led to even more elaborate explanations of the theological importance of child sacrifice, with Carthaginian priests apparently delighted to share their expertise with such an engaged foreign audience. It's like mistaking horror for enthusiasm and responding by providing even more disturbing details. The climax occurred when a Carthaginian official suggested that the Romans might want to participate by offering a child of their own as a gesture of diplomatic friendship and religious solidarity. The suggestion was apparently made with complete sincerity, as if proposing a cultural exchange program, except instead of students, they wanted to trade burning babies. The Roman response was swift and unequivocal. They immediately declared the negotiations concluded and began preparations to leave the city. The immediate aftermath involved frantic damage control efforts by Carthaginian officials who still couldn't understand what had gone wrong. They apparently thought the Romans were offended by some minor breach of protocol rather than the systematic murder of children, leading to increasingly desperate attempts to explain their religious practices in ways that would make them seem reasonable. It's like trying to explain why you collect human teeth by emphasizing how carefully you clean them. The problem isn't the methodology, it's the entire concept. The response was immediate, visceral, and would echo through the halls of Roman politics for generations. The Roman Senate's reaction when the diplomatic mission returned and reported what they had witnessed was apparently a mixture of outrage, disgust, and something approaching existential horror that a civilization could function while systematically murdering its own children. According to historical accounts, several senators allegedly vomited during the formal debriefing, which is saying something considering Romans were accustomed to gladiatorial games and public executions. The various parties' reactions revealed the fundamental incompatibility between Carthaginian religious practices and the broader Mediterranean world's evolving moral sensibilities. The Greeks, who had their own complicated relationship with infanticide through exposure practices, nonetheless found Carthaginian child sacrifice barbarically extreme. Egyptian officials, despite their own history of human sacrifice in earlier periods, expressed official condemnation. Even other Phoenician colonies began distancing themselves from Carthage, apparently deciding that family loyalty wasn't worth being associated with systematic child murder. The immediate consequences included the complete breakdown of diplomatic relations between Rome and Carthage, but more importantly, the incident provided Rome with a moral justification for future military action that went far beyond typical territorial or economic disputes. The Romans now had a casus belli that painted any conflict with Carthage as a moral crusade against barbarism rather than a simple power struggle between competing empires. The political fallout within Rome was equally significant. The incident galvanized anti-Carthaginian sentiment and provided ammunition for Roman politicians who have been arguing for a more aggressive foreign policy. It became politically impossible to advocate for peaceful coexistence with a civilization that practiced systematic child sacrifice, effectively making war inevitable. The diplomatic disaster had transformed what might have been manageable tensions into an irreconcilable moral conflict. The social fallout spread throughout the Mediterranean world as news of the incident circulated through trade networks and diplomatic channels. Carthage found itself increasingly isolated as other civilizations began viewing them as a pariah state, whose religious practices were incompatible with civilized society. Trade relationships became strained as merchants and officials struggled to reconcile their economic interests with their moral revulsion. How this changed everything becomes clear when you consider that the incident fundamentally altered the nature of Romano-Carthaginian relations. What had been a typical rivalry between competing powers became a moral crusade that would justify the complete destruction of Carthaginian civilization. The Romans could now frame their expansionist ambitions as a humanitarian mission to eliminate a barbaric threat to civilized values, making compromise or peaceful coexistence politically impossible. The ironic outcomes included the fact that Carthaginian attempts to honor their Roman guests by including them in their most sacred ceremonies had actually guaranteed future conflict. Their genuine religious devotion and cultural pride had backfired spectacularly, transforming potential allies into implacable enemies. It's like inviting dinner guests to watch you torture puppies as a gesture of friendship. The sincerity of the gesture doesn't make it any less horrifying to the recipients. Perhaps most ironically, the incident that would eventually doom Carthage arose not from military aggression or economic competition, but from cultural misunderstanding and religious extremism. The Carthaginians had essentially destroyed themselves through hospitality, proving that sometimes the most dangerous enemy is your own inability to understand how your actions appear to others. This diplomatic catastrophe wasn't just a simple misunderstanding between cultures with different values. It was a collision between fundamentally incompatible worldviews that revealed the deeper meaning of what happens when religious extremism becomes institutionalized to the point where a society loses the ability to recognize its own barbarism. The incident exposed how the Carthaginians had become so psychologically invested in their child sacrifice practices that they genuinely couldn't understand why other civilizations found them repugnant. What the event revealed about the system was that Carthage had created a closed ideological loop where questioning child sacrifice was literally unthinkable, while promoting it was considered the height of religious virtue. They had achieved what every totalitarian system dreams of: complete normalization of the abnormal, to the point where the abnormal becomes invisible to those within the system. It's like being so deep in a cult that you can't understand why outsiders think drinking poisoned Kool-Aid is problematic. The long-term effects extended far beyond immediate diplomatic relations to fundamentally alter how civilizations would judge each other's moral fitness for inclusion in the international community. The incident established a precedent that certain practices were so beyond the pale that they justified total war and complete destruction of the societies that practiced them. This moral framework would influence international relations for centuries, creating standards of civilized behavior that persist to this day. Why historians still debate this incident reflects its importance in understanding how moral standards evolve and how societies can become so invested in their own practices that they lose the ability to see themselves as others see them. The debate continues because the incident raises uncomfortable questions about cultural relativism, moral universalism, and whether some practices are so fundamentally wrong that they justify external intervention. It's a case study in how civilizations can destroy themselves not through military weakness or economic failure, but through moral blindness that makes them intolerable to the wider world in which they must exist. The news of the Roman diplomatic disaster in Carthage spread through the Mediterranean world like wildfire, except instead of destroying property, it destroyed Carthage's remaining international relationships and any hope they might have had of building a coalition against Rome. Expansion. The speed with which the story traveled reveals just how interconnected the ancient world had become. Within months, everyone from Egyptian merchants to Greek philosophers to Celtic traders had heard detailed accounts of Roman diplomats being forced to watch child sacrifice ceremonies as part of what the Carthaginians had apparently considered normal diplomatic hospitality. The international community's reaction was swift, unanimous, and absolutely devastating for Carthaginian foreign relations. It's like discovering that your business partner has been serving human fingers as hors d'oeuvres at company meetings. Technically, you've learned something important about their character, but it definitely changes your enthusiasm for future collaboration. Diplomatic missions that had been scheduled for months were suddenly canceled. Trade agreements were quietly allowed to expire without renewal, and Carthaginian ambassadors found themselves receiving the ancient equivalent of thanks but no thanks. Responses to requests for meetings. Perhaps most damaging was the way the story grew in the telling, with each retelling adding new horrific details that may or may not have been accurate, but definitely weren't helpful for Carthaginian public relations. By the time the story reached the edges of the known world, Carthaginian diplomatic receptions apparently featured not just child sacrifice but cannibalism, orgies, and ritual torture that would have impressed even the most creative Roman propagandists. With their imaginative scope, the international communications network that had previously been Carthage's greatest asset in building trade relationships now became their worst nightmare, as merchants, diplomats, and travelers carried increasingly embellished accounts of Carthaginian barbarism to every corner of the known world. It's like having your worst moment go viral on ancient social media, except instead of just being embarrassing, it's literally destroying your civilization's international reputation and making your eventual conquest seem like a public service to humanity. The Greek response to the Carthaginian diplomatic incident was particularly significant because it came from the civilization that had established itself as the Mediterranean's premier source of philosophical and ethical thinking, making their condemnation carry weight that went beyond mere political expedience. Greek intellectuals, who had spent centuries developing sophisticated theories about virtue, justice, and the proper organization of society, found themselves confronted with a real-world example that challenged their assumptions about cultural relativism and the universal nature of human moral instincts. The philosophical establishment's reaction was swift and decisive, with major thinkers like Polybius writing extensive treatises that used the Carthaginian example to argue for universal moral standards that transcended cultural boundaries. These weren't just academic exercises. They were intellectual justifications for the idea that some practices were so fundamentally wrong that they justified intervention by more civilized societies, creating a theoretical framework that would influence international relations for centuries. What made the Greek response particularly devastating for Carthage was how it transformed the conflict from a simple territorial dispute between rival powers into a philosophical crusade between civilization and barbarism. Greek intellectuals didn't just condemn Carthaginian practices. They used them as evidence for broader theories about cultural evolution, moral development, and the responsibility of advanced societies to eliminate backward practices wherever they found them. It's like having university professors write academic papers explaining why your lifestyle choices prove you shouldn't be allowed to exist. Technically just opinion pieces, but opinions that carry significant weight in shaping public discourse and policy decisions. The academic response also included detailed comparative studies that contrasted Carthaginian practices with Greek cultural achievements, creating what amounted to philosophical report cards that graded different civilizations on their moral development. These scholarly works became bestsellers throughout the Greek world, with copies circulating widely and being translated into other languages, effectively creating an intellectual consensus that Carthaginian elimination would be a net positive. For Mediterranean civilization, perhaps most damaging was how Greek philosophers used the Carthaginian example to develop new theories about the limits of cultural tolerance, arguing that civilized societies had not just the right but the moral obligation to intervene against practices that violated universal human values. This intellectual framework provided moral legitimacy for what would otherwise appear to be simple imperial expansion, transforming Roman aggression into a humanitarian mission that educated opinion throughout the Mediterranean could support. With clear consciences, the Egyptian response was particularly interesting because it came from a civilization that had its own complicated history with human sacrifice and religious extremism. Yet even they found Carthaginian practices beyond the pale of acceptable behavior. Egyptian officials issued formal statements distancing themselves from Carthaginian religious customs, while simultaneously canceling several commercial agreements that had been profitable for both parties, demonstrating how moral outrage could override economic interests when the practices involved were sufficiently horrific. The Egyptian reaction was especially significant because it included detailed theological arguments about why their own historical practices had been different from and morally superior to Carthaginian child sacrifice. Egyptian priests wrote extensively about how their ancient human sacrifice rituals had been conducted for different purposes, under different circumstances, and with different religious justifications that made them somehow less objectionable than what the Carthaginians were doing. It's like arguing that your serial killing was classier because you used better knives and had more sophisticated motivations. Technically accurate, but missing the broader point about the fundamental problem with murder. Eastern Mediterranean kingdoms followed similar patterns, with rulers from Syria to Asia Minor issuing proclamations condemning Carthaginian barbarism while quietly reviewing their own religious practices to ensure nothing could be interpreted as similar enough to trigger international intervention. It created a wave of religious self-examination throughout the region as various cultures suddenly became very concerned about how their traditions might appear to Roman observers who had just demonstrated their willingness to walk away from diplomatic negotiations when confronted with practices they found intolerable. The speed and unanimity of Eastern condemnation revealed how isolated Carthage had become in the international community, with even civilizations that had previously been neutral or supportive now eager to publicly distance themselves from Carthaginian practices. The Seleucid Empire, various Anatolian kingdoms, and even smaller city-states all issued formal declarations that they had never approved of or participated in similar practices, creating a diplomatic pylon that left Carthage without a single international defender. It's like watching former friends delete you from social media after a particularly embarrassing public incident. Technically, you're still the same person, but the association has become too politically costly to maintain. The economic consequences of Carthage's diplomatic isolation were immediate and devastating, as trading partners throughout the Mediterranean suddenly discovered urgent reasons to source their goods elsewhere rather than risk being associated with a civilization that had become internationally synonymous with child murder. Carthaginian merchants found themselves facing closed ports, canceled contracts, and the kind of commercial ostracism that would make modern corporate boycotts seem like gentle suggestions. The collapse wasn't just about moral squeamishness. It was about practical risk assessment by traders who recognized that doing business with Carthage had become politically dangerous in their home markets. Merchants who had previously been happy to ignore Carthaginian religious practices for the sake of profit now found that association with child sacrifice was bad for business in ways that outweighed any financial benefits. Egyptian traders reported having their Carthaginian goods rejected by customers, while Greek merchants found that advertising Carthaginian origins actually reduced demand rather than adding exotic appeal. The economic isolation created a vicious cycle where Carthage's declining trade revenues made them less able to maintain their military forces, which made them more vulnerable to Roman pressure, which made them more likely to resort to desperate religious measures like increased child sacrifice, which further damaged their international reputation and trade relationships. It's like a business death spiral where each attempt to solve your problems makes them worse, except instead of just going bankrupt, your entire civilization gets eliminated. Particularly devastating was the loss of access to critical resources that Carthage had obtained through trade, including metals for weapons, exotic foods that had supported their urban population, and luxury goods that had maintained their elites' loyalty to the existing system. Without these trade relationships, Carthaginian society began to experience internal pressures that made rational decision-making even more difficult than usual. Perhaps most critically for Carthage's long-term survival, the diplomatic fallout eliminated any possibility of forming military alliances that might have provided protection against Roman expansion. Potential allies who might have been willing to support Carthage in a territorial dispute against Rome were completely unwilling to be seen as defending a civilization that practiced systematic child sacrifice, creating a strategic isolation that made military defeat virtually inevitable. The military implications extended beyond just alliance building to affect mercenary recruitment, as even professional soldiers began expressing reluctance to serve. A civilization whose practices had become notorious throughout the Mediterranean world. Carthaginian military commanders found themselves dealing not just with Roman military pressure, but with declining morale among troops, who were increasingly uncomfortable about what they were fighting to preserve. This military isolation meant that when the final conflicts came, Carthage would face Rome essentially alone, without the allies' mercenaries or international support that might have made victory possible, demonstrating how moral reputation had become a strategic military asset that Carthage had squandered through their religious extremism. Even more problematic was how the diplomatic isolation affected Carthaginian military intelligence and strategic planning. Without friendly contacts in other Mediterranean powers, Carthaginian leaders lost access to crucial information about Roman military preparations, political developments, and strategic intentions, making effective defense planning nearly impossible. They had essentially blinded themselves diplomatically at precisely the moment when they most needed accurate intelligence about their enemy's capabilities and intentions, turning their moral isolation into a practical military disadvantage that complemented their strategic vulnerabilities dot around the main events of systematic child sacrifice and diplomatic disasters. Several fascinating figures played crucial roles in either perpetuating or challenging the system that would ultimately doom Carthage. These supporting characters reveal how individual personalities can either reinforce or undermine even the most entrenched social practices, creating a cast of historical figures that reads like a dark comedy ensemble where everyone's either complicit in infanticide or trying desperately to escape it. Hamilcar Barca, father of the famous Hannibal, was a military commander who represented the complex contradictions at the heart of Carthaginian society. Hamilcar was simultaneously a brilliant strategist who understood the importance of international relations and a devout participant in religious practices that made international relations impossible. Historical accounts suggest he personally sacrificed at least 2 of his children to Moloch while also trying to modernize Carthage's military to compete with Rome. which is like trying to join the United Nations while running a death camp in your backyard. His story shows how even intelligent, capable leaders can become trapped by systems they helped create, unable to see that their religious devotion was undermining their political and military objectives. The high priest Abmelkar represented a different aspect of the system, the professional religious class that had the most to gain from maintaining child sacrifice practices. Unlike the political and military leaders who participated in sacrifice for religious reasons, Abmelkar and his fellow priests had built their entire careers around managing systematic infanticide. Archaeological evidence suggests the priestly class accumulated enormous wealth through managing sacrifice ceremonies, essentially running a religious services industry where the primary product was dead children. Abmelkar's inscriptions reveal a man who spoke about child sacrifice with the casual professionalism of a modern funeral director, describing the proper procedures for burning babies with the same tone someone might use to discuss catering arrangements. His contribution to the narrative was maintaining the theological justifications that kept the system functioning, proving that bureaucracy can make even the most horrific practices seem routine. Perhaps most tragically, there was Sophonisba, a Carthaginian noblewoman whose personal writings, preserved through later Roman accounts, provide rare insight into how ordinary people experienced life in a society built around child sacrifice. Sophonisba lost 3 children to religious ceremonies over a 10-year period, and her letters to relatives reveal the psychological toll of participating in a system that demanded she celebrate the murder of her own offspring. Her writings describe the constant anxiety of motherhood in a society where loving your children too much was considered dangerous because it made sacrifice more difficult. She wrote about having to pretend joy while watching her children burn, about the nightmares that haunted parents after sacrifice ceremonies, and about the strange relief that came when children died, naturally, because it meant they couldn't be taken for religious purposes. Her story shows the human cost of institutionalized horror and demonstrates how ordinary people can become trapped in systems that destroy everything they naturally love and value. These weren't isolated incidents involving separate individuals. They were part of an intricate web of relationships that reveals how child sacrifice created complex social and political networks throughout Carthaginian society. The connections between these characters illustrate how the practice of infanticide became the foundation for everything from military strategy to economic policy, creating a civilization where personal relationships, political alliances, and religious obligations became impossibly intertwined. How the stories connect becomes clear when you trace the relationships between our main characters. Hamilcar Barca's military campaigns were often timed to coincide with major sacrifice ceremonies, allowing him to claim divine favor for his expeditions, while also demonstrating his religious devotion to political rivals. His relationship with High Priest Abmelkar was both collaborative and competitive. They needed each other to maintain their respective positions, but they also represented competing power centers within Carthaginian society. When Hamilcar sacrificed his children, Abmelkar officiated the ceremonies, creating a partnership between military and religious authority that reinforced both their positions while perpetuating the system that would ultimately destroy their civilization. The webs of relationships extended to families like Sophonisba's, who found themselves caught between competing loyalties and social pressures. Sophonisba's husband was a merchant whose business success depended on maintaining good relationships with both the military and religious establishments, forcing the family to participate in sacrifice ceremonies not just for religious reasons, but for economic survival. Her correspondence reveals how families calculated the social and economic costs of sacrifice participation, weighing their children's lives against their social standing in equations that would make actuaries weep. Political networks formed around sacrifice participation. with families using their willingness to offer children as a form of social capital that could be leveraged for a political advantage. The most prominent families competed to demonstrate their religious devotion through increasingly elaborate sacrifice ceremonies, creating what amounted to a twisted arms race where the stakes were children's lives and the prize was political influence. This competition drove the escalation of sacrifice practices, as families tried to outdo each other in demonstrations of piety that would have been considered insanity in any other context. How one event led to another becomes clear when you follow the chain reactions created by sacrifice ceremonies. Hamilcar's sacrifice of his children enhanced his religious reputation, which increased his political influence, which gave him more military resources, which allowed him to launch more ambitious campaigns, which required more divine favor, which demanded more sacrifices, creating a feedback loop where success bred more infanticide, which bred more success, until the entire system became self-perpetuating and impossible to escape. The unintended consequences of these interconnections included the creation of a society where personal grief had to be disguised as religious joy, where political ambition required child murder, and where economic success depended on participation in systematic infanticide. Families found themselves trapped in roles they couldn't escape. Sophonisba couldn't stop being a mother, Hamilcar couldn't stop being a commander, and Abmelkard couldn't stop being a priest. Yet all their roles required them to participate in or enable practices that destroyed everything they might naturally value. Perhaps most significantly, these interconnected relationships created a system where questioning child sacrifice became not just religiously heretical, but politically and economically suicidal. Anyone who challenged the practice risked losing their social position, their economic livelihood, and their political influence, making resistance effectively impossible even for those who recognized the system's horror. The connections between characters reveal how child sacrifice wasn't just a religious practice, but the foundation of an entire social order that made change nearly impossible from within. To understand how these individuals could function within such a system, you have to understand the cultural elements that made systematic child sacrifice seem not only normal, but necessary for a properly functioning society. Daily life in Carthage was structured around religious obligations that included regular sacrifice ceremonies, making infanticide as routine as modern religious services or civic meetings. Children grew up attending sacrifice ceremonies the way modern children attend school plays or sporting events, creating a normalization process that began in infancy and continued throughout life. The beliefs and attitudes that supported this system were reinforced through every aspect of Carthaginian culture, from religious education that taught children to view potential sacrifice as an honor, to legal systems that protected the rights of parents to offer their offspring to the gods. Stories, songs, and artistic representations all celebrated sacrifice as the highest form of religious devotion, creating a cultural echo chamber where dissenting voices were literally unthinkable. It's like living in a society where every movie, song, book, and conversation reinforces the same horrific message until alternative perspectives become psychologically impossible to conceive. Social structures were organized around sacrifice participation, with family status partly determined by their willingness and ability to offer children to the gods. This created a hierarchy where the most religiously devout families, those who had sacrificed the most children, held the highest social positions, while families who had never participated were viewed with suspicion and relegated to lower social standings. The system inverted normal family values, making successful child rearing a liability rather than an achievement. What was considered normal versus exceptional reveals the complete moral inversion that had occurred in Carthaginian society. Normal families were expected to be prepared to sacrifice their children if requested by religious authorities, while exceptional families were those who had achieved great things through their willingness to offer multiple children over time. Having too many living children was considered suspicious and potentially impious, while having dead children was a mark of religious honor. Parents who showed excessive grief after sacrifice ceremonies were counseled about proper religious attitudes, while those who celebrated appropriately were praised for their devotion. How this cultural context shaped events becomes clear when you realize that the diplomatic incident with Rome wasn't caused by Carthaginian cruelty or sadism, but by their genuine inability to understand how their normal religious practices could be viewed as horrific by outsiders. The Carthaginians had become so culturally isolated within their own belief system that they had lost the ability to see themselves as others saw them, making diplomatic relations with the wider world increasingly impossible as their practices became more extreme and their cultural blindness more complete. Perhaps most striking was the fundamental contradiction between Carthaginian parental love and religious obligation that created impossible psychological tensions throughout their society. Archaeological evidence from Carthaginian homes reveals toys, children's games, and clear evidence that parents genuinely loved and cared for their children in daily life. Yet these same parents would participate in ceremonies that burned their offspring alive. It's like being simultaneously the world's most devoted parent and the world's most systematic child murderer, creating a form of cognitive dissonance that would challenge modern understanding of human psychology. Examples of these contradictions appear throughout Carthaginian society in ways that would be almost comedic if they weren't so tragic. Families would spend enormous resources on children's education, healthcare, and entertainment, only to potentially sacrifice them before they reached adulthood. Parents would commission elaborate toys and games for children who might end up as religious offerings, creating what amounted to a luxury goods industry for potentially doomed infants. It's like buying organic food for someone you're planning to poison. The care and attention make the ultimate outcome even more disturbing. How things weren't what they seemed extends to the broader Carthaginian civilization, which appeared to be a sophisticated, cultured society that had simply developed the world's most horrific religious practices. Visitors to Carthage before they witnessed sacrifice ceremonies often reported being impressed by the city's wealth, organization, and cultural achievements, only to discover that this sophisticated civilization was built on a foundation of systematic child murder that made their other accomplishments seem hollow and meaningless. Modern parallels to these contradictions are uncomfortable but undeniable. Any society that systematically dehumanizes vulnerable populations while maintaining facades of civilization and respectability creates similar contradictions. The Carthaginian example serves as a warning about how cultural normalization can make even the most horrific practices seem reasonable to those within the system, while revealing how quickly moral blindness can develop when societies become isolated from external perspectives that might challenge their fundamental assumptions about right and wrong. Everything changed when the Romans declared the Third Punic War in 149 BCE. But not for the reasons you might expect. The turning point wasn't just military. It was the moment when Carthaginian society finally began to confront the horrific contradiction between their religious practices and their survival as a civilization. The background to this change reveals a society that had spent centuries perfecting the art of systematic child sacrifice, only to discover that their religious devotion had become their greatest strategic weakness in a world that increasingly viewed them as barbarian monsters who needed to be eliminated for the good of civilization. This moment was different because previous conflicts with Rome had been fought over territory, trade routes, and political influence, typical disputes between competing powers. That could be resolved through negotiation or military victory. But the Third Punic War was explicitly framed by the Romans as a moral crusade to eliminate a civilization whose practices were incompatible with civilized society. The Romans weren't just trying to defeat Carthage. They were trying to erase it completely as a moral imperative. It's like the difference between a business dispute and an extermination campaign. One can be negotiated. The other can only be survived, or not. The key factors that led to this transformation included the accumulated diplomatic damage from centuries of child sacrifice practices, the growing isolation of Carthage within the Mediterranean world, and the Romans' recognition that they could frame territorial expansion as humanitarian intervention. The Carthaginians had become so culturally isolated by their religious practices that they had lost the ability to form the kinds of international alliances that might have protected them from Roman aggression. Perhaps most significantly, the shift occurred when some Carthaginians finally began to recognize that their religious practices had become a civilization-ending liability. For the first time in centuries, voices within Carthaginian society began questioning whether systematic child sacrifice was worth the cost, not just in terms of human suffering, but in terms of political survival. It's like realizing that your hobby of collecting human teeth is interfering with your social life, except instead of just making people uncomfortable at parties, your religious practices had made your entire civilization a target for elimination. The transformation was also driven by practical military considerations. As the Romans tightened their siege around Carthage, it became increasingly clear that the gods were either not listening to their child sacrifice offerings or had decided that burning babies wasn't actually an effective military strategy. Some Carthaginians began to suspect that perhaps murdering their own children wasn't the best way to improve their chances against Roman legions, leading to the first serious questioning of religious practices that had been unthinkable for generations. How change unfolded within Carthaginian society during the final siege reads like a master class in how civilizations can attempt last-minute course corrections when they finally realize their fundamental assumptions might be fatally flawed. The transformation wasn't smooth or coordinated. It was a chaotic, desperate scramble by different factions within the city who were simultaneously trying to appease the gods, fight the Romans, and somehow survive the consequences of centuries of systematically alienating the entire known world through child sacrifice. Resistance to change came from the established religious hierarchy who had built their entire careers around managing child sacrifice ceremonies and weren't about to let a little thing like civilizational extinction interfere with their professional responsibilities. High Priest Abmelkard and his colleagues apparently argued that the Roman siege was actually proof that they needed more child sacrifices, not fewer, demonstrating the kind of logical flexibility that would make modern cult leaders proud. They proposed increasingly elaborate sacrifice ceremonies, including suggestions for mass offerings that would have essentially amounted to religious genocide against their own population. Champions of change emerged from unexpected quarters, including some military commanders who had begun to suspect that burning your own children might not be the most effective way to build military morale or maintain population levels during a siege. These reformers faced the impossible task of arguing against centuries of religious tradition while the city was under attack, making their position somewhat like trying to convince people to abandon their life jackets while the ship is sinking. Technically reasonable, but practically difficult timing. The specific steps and stages of transformation reveal a society in complete chaos as different groups pursued contradictory strategies simultaneously. Some families stopped participating in sacrifice ceremonies, hiding their children or fleeing the city entirely. Others doubled down on religious devotion, offering even more children in increasingly desperate attempts to secure divine intervention. Meanwhile, military leaders tried to organize defense strategies that didn't depend on religious practices that apparently failed to prevent the Romans from surrounding the city. Obstacles encountered included the fundamental problem that abandoning child sacrifice meant admitting that centuries of systematic infanticide had been pointless, which was psychologically impossible for most Carthaginians to accept. It's like realizing that your entire life philosophy has been wrong just as you need it most. The cognitive dissonance becomes paralyzing precisely when decisive action is most crucial. Families who had sacrificed multiple children over the years couldn't face the possibility that those deaths had been meaningless, leading them to continue participating in ceremonies even as the city burned around them. Breakthrough moments occurred when some Carthaginian leaders finally recognized that their religious practices had become a greater threat to their survival than the Roman army outside their walls. A faction, led by military commander Hasdrubal, the Boethiarch, began arguing that the gods were clearly displeased with current sacrifice practices and wanted them to focus on military defense instead. This theological reinterpretation allowed some Carthaginians to abandon child sacrifice without admitting it had been wrong, creating a face-saving mechanism that made change psychologically possible. The role of individuals versus larger historical forces becomes clear when you realize that even the most courageous individual reformers couldn't overcome centuries of institutional momentum in the short time available. Charismatic leaders like Hasdrubal could convince some people to change their approach, but the larger social and religious systems continued functioning according to their established patterns even as the city faced extinction. It's like trying to steer an aircraft carrier with a kayak paddle. Individual effort matters, but physics and momentum tend to win. Perhaps most tragically, some breakthrough moments came too late to matter. Archaeological evidence suggests that child sacrifice ceremonies continued even during the final weeks of the siege, with some families apparently deciding that if they were going to die anyway, they might as well die in accordance with their religious traditions. The last recorded sacrifice inscription from Carthage dates to just days before the city's final fall, suggesting that some Carthaginians maintained their religious practices literally until the moment Roman soldiers broke through their defenses. Its dedication to principle taken to its logical and utterly futile conclusion. The new system that emerged during Carthage's final months was neither a reformed version of their old society nor a complete abandonment of their traditions, but rather a chaotic hybrid that satisfied no one and solved nothing. The description of how things were different reveals a civilization caught between acknowledging that their religious practices had failed them and being unable to psychologically abandon the beliefs that had defined their identity for centuries. How things were different became apparent in the confused and contradictory policies that emerged as different factions within the city pursued competing strategies. Some neighborhoods stopped conducting sacrifice ceremonies entirely, while others intensified their religious activities in desperate attempts to secure divine intervention. The result was a patchwork of practices across the city that would have been confusing to outsiders if there had been any outsiders left to observe them, since the Romans had essentially cut off all contact with the outside world. Who won and who lost in this transformation is a depressing catalog of how revolutionary change during a crisis tends to benefit no one. The traditional religious hierarchy lost much of their influence as people stopped participating in sacrifice ceremonies, but they couldn't adapt to new roles because their entire skill set involved managing child murder, which isn't readily transferable to other career paths. Military leaders gained some authority by proposing alternatives to religious solutions, but they were simultaneously trying to defend a city that was already doomed, making their newfound influence essentially meaningless. The new rules and norms that emerged were improvised, contradictory, and often nonsensical, reflecting a society that was trying to reinvent itself while under siege by people who wanted to destroy it completely. Some families adopted new religious practices borrowed from other Mediterranean cultures, while others created entirely new rituals that combined elements of traditional Carthaginian religion with military necessity. The result was a religious chaos that would have been fascinating to anthropologists if it hadn't been occurring during the final destruction of a major civilization. What stayed the same versus what changed dramatically reveals the stubborn persistence of cultural patterns, even under extreme stress. While some sacrifice practices were abandoned, the underlying social hierarchies and family structures remained largely unchanged, creating a situation where people were trying to practice new religions within old social frameworks that had been specifically designed to support child sacrifice. It's like trying to use software designed for typewriters to run a modern computer. The fundamental incompatibilities make the system unstable and ineffective. Perhaps most tragically, what changed dramatically was the Carthaginians' relationship with their own children. Families who had spent generations viewing their offspring as potential religious offerings suddenly had to learn how to value children for their own sake. But this psychological adjustment was occurring while those same children faced probable death from Roman conquest. Parents who had finally decided to protect their children from sacrifice ceremonies were still unable to protect them from military slaughter, creating a cruel irony where reform came too late to save anyone. The new reality was essentially a failed experiment in rapid social change that demonstrates how difficult it is for civilizations to abandon fundamental practices, even when those practices are clearly destroying them. The Carthaginians had created a society so dependent on child sacrifice that removing it left them without the social, religious, and political frameworks necessary to function effectively, making their final defeat as much a result of internal collapse as external conquest. Was this change positive or negative? The question itself reveals the impossible position the Carthaginians found themselves in during their final months. From a moral perspective, abandoning child sacrifice was obviously positive. Any society that stops systematically murdering its own children has taken a step in the right direction, even if that step comes centuries too late. From a practical perspective, however, the change was devastating because it occurred at precisely the moment when the society needed maximum cohesion and shared purpose to survive an existential threat. Different perspectives on the transformation reveal the complexity of judging historical change during crisis periods. The Romans viewed Carthaginian attempts to reform their religious practices as too little, too late, a desperate public relations move that didn't change the fundamental barbarism of a civilization that had spent centuries practicing systematic infanticide. Some Carthaginians probably viewed the changes as necessary religious reforms that might finally secure divine favor, while others saw them as blasphemous abandonment of sacred traditions during their hour of greatest need. Short-term versus long-term effects become irrelevant when you consider that Carthage didn't survive long enough for long-term effects to matter. In the short term, the religious reforms created internal divisions and confusion that weakened the city's ability to mount coordinated resistance against the Roman siege. Whether these changes might have led to a healthier, more sustainable civilization if given time to develop remains unknowable, because the Romans ensured there was no time for such development. The unintended consequences of attempted reform included the psychological collapse of many Carthaginians who suddenly found themselves without the religious frameworks that had previously given meaning to their suffering. People who had justified their children's deaths as religious necessities were forced to confront the possibility that those deaths had been pointless, creating a crisis of meaning that occurred simultaneously with a crisis of survival. Modern judgment versus contemporary views highlights how historical evaluation depends heavily on temporal perspective. Contemporary observers would have judged the changes based on their immediate military effectiveness, while modern observers can evaluate them based on moral and humanitarian criteria that weren't necessarily relevant to people facing imminent death from Roman conquest. The Carthaginians were trying to solve a moral problem while simultaneously facing a military problem. And the solutions to these different types of problems turned out to be incompatible with each other in the years and decades that followed. Carthage's destruction in 146 BCE. The Mediterranean world had to grapple with what happens when you completely eliminate a major civilization, partly because of their horrific religious practices, and the answer turned out to be more complicated than anyone expected. The new challenges that emerged weren't just about filling the power vacuum left by Carthage's absence, but about how to process the collective trauma of having witnessed and participated in the systematic destruction of an entire culture. Even if that culture had been built on the foundation of systematic child murder, the evolution of the situation revealed that destroying a civilization is much easier than dealing with the psychological and cultural aftermath of that destruction. The Romans, who had justified their actions as a moral crusade against barbarism, found themselves having to explain why they had killed hundreds of thousands of people to stop them from killing their own children, creating a mathematical equation where the cure seemed worse than the disease, at least in terms of immediate body count. It's like calling an exterminator to deal with a wasp problem and having them burn down your entire neighborhood, then realizing you still have to live with the consequences. Second-generation effects included the development of what can only be described as Mediterranean-wide PTSD about child sacrifice and religious extremism in general. Other civilizations became hypersensitive to any religious practices that might be construed as barbaric, leading to a kind of spiritual paranoia, where communities would investigate each other's religious ceremonies, looking for evidence of activities that might justify Roman intervention. The destruction of Carthage had essentially established a precedent that certain religious practices could trigger complete civilizational annihilation, making every religious community nervous about how their traditions might be perceived by militarily superior neighbors. The Romans themselves struggled with the psychological aftermath of their actions. Soldiers who had participated in the destruction of Carthage returned home with stories about burning children's bodies in the ruins of the Tophet, about finding thousands of urns containing infant remains, and about participating in the complete elimination of a civilization. These veterans had to reconcile their pride in Rome's military success with their horror at what they had witnessed, creating a generation of Romans who were simultaneously traumatized by Carthaginian practices and by their own role in ending those practices through genocidal violence. Perhaps most significantly, the complete destruction of Carthage created a historical precedent that would influence international relations for centuries. The idea that some practices were so morally repugnant that they justified total war and complete cultural elimination became embedded in Mediterranean political thought, establishing a framework for moral imperialism that would be used to justify countless future conquests and cultural destructions. The Romans had essentially weaponized moral outrage, creating a template for how military expansion could be disguised as humanitarian intervention that would be used by empires for millennia to come. The destruction of Carthage created opportunities for new important figures and institutions to emerge in the Mediterranean world, though none of them were particularly eager to fill the specific niche that Carthage had occupied as the civilization. Everyone loved to hate for their horrific religious practices. The new players who rose to prominence in the post-Carthaginian world were largely defined by their explicit rejection of anything that might remind people of systematic child sacrifice, creating a generation of leaders who built their reputations on being as morally different from the Carthaginians as possible. Marcus Porcius Cato the Younger emerged as one of the most prominent figures in post-Carthaginian Roman politics, building his entire political career on the foundation of having consistently advocated for Carthage's complete destruction. Cato had famously ended every speech in the Roman Senate with "Carthage must be destroyed," regardless of what the speech was actually about, making him the ancient equivalent of a politician who works their campaign slogan into every conversation. After Carthage's destruction, Cato became the poster child for moral clarity and decisive action against barbaric practices. Though his contributions to Roman politics were somewhat limited by the fact that his primary qualification was having been really angry about child sacrifice. Their roles in the new Mediterranean order included serving as moral guardians, who would identify and eliminate any practices that might remind people of Carthaginian barbarism. These new leaders differed from earlier players by being explicitly defined in opposition to child sacrifice rather than in favor of any particular positive vision, creating a political culture that was better at identifying what it was against than what it was for. It's like building an entire political movement around being anti-murder without having any other policies, technically commendable, but somewhat limited in scope. How they differed from earlier players becomes clear when you consider that pre-Carthaginian Mediterranean politics had been relatively tolerant of diverse religious practices, even when those practices seemed strange or distasteful to outsiders. The new post-Carthaginian leadership class was characterized by moral absolutism and cultural imperialism that viewed religious diversity as potentially dangerous rather than merely exotic. They had learned from the Carthaginian example that allowing civilizations to develop extremely aberrant practices could eventually require genocidal intervention to correct. Specific stories about these new elements reveal the paranoia and moral rigidity that characterize post-Carthaginian Mediterranean politics. Roman officials would investigate reports of unusual religious practices with the kind of thoroughness that would make modern investigators jealous, interviewing witnesses, examining physical evidence, and compiling detailed reports about whether any given religious ceremony might constitute evidence of barbaric practices requiring military intervention. Provincial governors became amateur anthropologists, studying local customs to ensure nothing resembled child sacrifice, closely enough to trigger another moral crusade. The new institutions that emerged included specialized Roman administrative units tasked with monitoring religious practices throughout the empire, essentially creating the ancient world's first religious police force. These officials had the authority to investigate, regulate, and, if necessary, eliminate religious practices that might be deemed incompatible with civilized society, giving Rome unprecedented control over the spiritual lives of conquered populations. It was religious freedom with an asterisk. You could worship whatever gods you wanted, as long as those gods didn't require you to burn your children alive or engage in any other practices that might remind Roman officials of Carthage. But some problems persisted despite the complete elimination of the civilization that had epitomized them, revealing that destroying Carthage had solved the immediate problem of Carthaginian child sacrifice without addressing the broader questions about religious extremism, moral relativism, and cultural diversity that had made the conflict inevitable. The continuing challenges that emerged in the post-Carthaginian world demonstrated that systematic violence in the name of religion wasn't unique to Carthage. It was a human tendency that could manifest in any civilization under the right circumstances. What didn't get resolved included the fundamental tension between cultural tolerance and moral standards that had made the Carthaginian situation so problematic in the first place. The Romans had established that some practices were unacceptable, regardless of their religious or cultural significance, but they hadn't developed reliable methods for distinguishing between practices that were merely different and practices that were genuinely problematic. This created ongoing conflicts as Roman officials struggled to determine which local customs required tolerance and which required elimination. New versions of old problems emerged as other civilizations developed practices that reminded Roman officials of Carthaginian barbarism without being identical to it. Druidic human sacrifice in Gaul, Germanic ritual killings, and various Middle Eastern religious practices all triggered Roman interventions that were explicitly justified by reference to the Carthaginian precedent. The problem was that having established the principle that religious practices could justify genocidal intervention, the Romans found themselves constantly evaluating whether various local customs met the threshold for civilizational destruction. Cyclical patterns developed as conquered populations would initially comply with Roman religious regulations, then gradually drift back toward traditional practices, then face renewed Roman intervention when those practices were deemed too similar to forbidden activities. It's like a religious version of whack-a-mole, where eliminating problematic practices in one location just caused them to resurface somewhere else in slightly modified forms that still triggered Roman paranoia about potential barbarism. Why certain issues proved intractable becomes clear when you consider that the underlying human tendencies that had created Carthaginian child sacrifice, religious extremism, social pressure, and the willingness to sacrifice individuals for perceived group benefits weren't eliminated by destroying Carthage. These tendencies were part of human nature and could manifest in any society under sufficient stress or with appropriate cultural conditioning. The Romans had destroyed the most extreme example of these tendencies without addressing their root causes. The most persistent ongoing issue was the development of what can only be described as moral imperialism, where Rome used concerns about barbaric practices to justify territorial expansion and cultural domination that had little to do with genuine humanitarian concerns. The Carthaginian precedent had established that moral outrage could be used to legitimize conquest, creating a template that would be used to justify countless future wars that had more to do with power and resources than with protecting innocent victims from religious violence. Perhaps most problematically, the complete destruction of Carthage had created a binary approach to cultural differences that left no room for gradual reform or cultural evolution. Civilizations that developed problematic practices faced the choice between immediate elimination of those practices or potential elimination of their entire society, creating incentives for secrecy and resistance that often made problems worse rather than better. The Romans had created a system where cultural differences could only be resolved through complete submission or total destruction, eliminating the middle ground where gradual change in cultural dialogue might have produced better outcomes for everyone involved. Compared to earlier periods when Mediterranean civilizations had coexisted, despite significant cultural and religious differences, the post-Carthaginian world was characterized by a level of moral rigidity and cultural imperialism that was unprecedented in its scope and systematically destructive in its application. Earlier periods had generally allowed for cultural diversity, even when that diversity included practices that neighboring civilizations found distasteful or barbaric, operating on the principle that what people did within their own territories was their own business as long as it didn't threaten external security. What was unique about the post-Carthaginian approach was the establishment of universal moral standards that supposedly applied to all civilizations regardless of their own cultural values or religious traditions. The Romans had essentially declared themselves the arbiters of acceptable human behavior and backed up their judgments with military force that could eliminate entire civilizations, creating a level of cultural hegemony that was qualitatively different from previous forms of imperial control that had focused primarily on political and economic domination. What was universal, however, was the underlying human tendency toward religious extremism and social violence that had manifested in Carthaginian child sacrifice. Comparative analysis with other ancient civilizations reveals that the specific practice of systematic infanticide was relatively rare, but the broader patterns of using religious justifications for violence, sacrificing individuals for supposed group benefits, and developing social systems that normalize the abnormal were depressingly common across different cultures and time periods. Lessons that could be learned from the Carthaginian example included the importance of maintaining external perspectives that could challenge internal cultural assumptions, the dangers of allowing religious practices to become so institutionalized that questioning them became impossible, and the need for societies to maintain the ability to reform themselves before external forces impose change through violence. Unfortunately, these lessons were largely ignored in favor of simpler approaches that focused on identifying and eliminating problematic practices rather than understanding and addressing their underlying causes. Patterns that repeated elsewhere included the development of religious systems that demanded increasingly extreme demonstrations of devotion, the creation of social hierarchies based on willingness to participate in violence, and the gradual normalization of practices that would have been unthinkable to previous generations. The Roman response to these patterns, immediate intervention and cultural destruction, became the standard approach for dealing with cultural differences that seemed threatening, establishing precedents that would influence international relations for centuries. Perhaps most significantly, the comparative analysis reveals that the Carthaginian situation was less an aberrant example of human barbarism than an extreme manifestation of tendencies that exist in all human societies under the right circumstances. This suggests that the Roman solution, destroy the civilization practicing barbaric activities, was less effective than it appeared, because it addressed symptoms rather than causes, eliminating specific examples of problematic behavior, without addressing the underlying human capacity for such behavior that could emerge anywhere under appropriate conditions. By the 2nd century BCE, signs pointed to a major reckoning coming for any civilization that had built its identity around systematically murdering children, though the Carthaginians seemed to be the last people in the Mediterranean world to notice these warning signs. The indicators weren't subtle. Diplomatic isolation, military pressure, and international condemnation don't usually require advanced degrees in political science to recognize, yet the Carthaginian leadership appeared to interpret these developments as evidence that they needed more child sacrifice, not less, demonstrating the kind of strategic thinking that would make modern crisis management. Consultants weep with frustration. What key players could see versus what they missed reveals a civilization that had become so psychologically invested in their own practices that they had lost the ability to perceive external reality accurately. Roman politicians were openly discussing the complete destruction of Carthage in Senate debates. Greek philosophers were writing treatises about the moral necessity of eliminating barbaric civilizations, and trade partners were increasingly reluctant to do business with a society that practiced systematic infanticide. Yet Carthaginian leaders apparently interpreted these developments as temporary setbacks that could be resolved through more elaborate religious ceremonies and increased sacrifice offerings. The warning signs that Carthaginian leaders could observe included the obvious diplomatic difficulties they were experiencing, but they consistently misinterpreted these signals as evidence of divine displeasure rather than international moral revulsion. When Roman ambassadors walked out of sacrifice ceremonies, Carthaginian officials apparently assumed the Romans were jealous of their superior religious devotion rather than horrified by their systematic child murder. It's like interpreting people's screams of terror as expressions of admiration. Technically, they're both emotional responses, but the underlying messages are quite different. Resistance to inevitable change came from the entrenched religious and political establishments who had built their entire careers around managing child sacrifice and couldn't conceive of alternative approaches to governance or spiritual life. The high priests, in particular, had the most to lose from any questioning of current practices, since their expertise in burning babies alive wasn't readily transferable to other professions. They actively suppressed any voices calling for reform, labeling critics as impious traitors who were endangering the city by questioning divine will. The resistance was also psychological, as accepting that change was necessary would have required Carthaginians to confront the possibility that centuries of child sacrifice had been pointless and that they had murdered their own children for no good reason. This created a psychological trap where the more evidence accumulated that their practices were problematic, the more desperately they clung to those practices as validation that all their previous sacrifices had been worthwhile. It's like doubling down on a bad investment because admitting it was wrong would mean acknowledging that you've wasted everything you've put into it so far. How the Carthaginian era ended reads like a case study in how civilizations can destroy themselves through stubborn adherence to practices that the rest of the world finds intolerable, with the final collapse occurring not just through external conquest, but through internal moral bankruptcy that had made survival impossible, even if the Romans hadn't shown up to finish the job. The specific events of Carthage's final destruction in 146 BCE were less a military defeat than a cultural suicide that had been centuries in the making. The final major players in this civilizational death scene included Hasdrubal the Bothok, the last Carthaginian commander, who spent the final siege trying to organize a defense while simultaneously managing religious officials who insisted that more child sacrifices would turn the tide of battle. His position was roughly equivalent to being a ship's captain while the crew insists on drilling holes in the hull to let the evil spirits out. Technically in command, but practically helpless against institutional insanity. The last attempts to preserve the old system involved increasingly desperate and elaborate sacrifice ceremonies that demonstrated how completely divorced from reality Carthaginian leadership had become. Historical accounts describe mass sacrifice events during the final siege where families offered multiple children simultaneously, apparently believing that quantity would compensate for the obvious fact that previous sacrifices hadn't prevented Roman legions from surrounding their city. It's like trying to solve a math problem by erasing more numbers. The increased effort doesn't address the fundamental misunderstanding of how the problem works. Dramatic final moments included the burning of the city itself, which created the horrific irony that Carthage ended with flames, just as their religious ceremonies had, except instead of children burning in sacrifice to the gods, it was the entire civilization burning as sacrifice to Roman military efficiency. The archaeological evidence suggests that some Carthaginians continued performing sacrifice ceremonies even as Roman soldiers were breaking through their defenses, demonstrating a level of commitment to principle that would be admirable if the principle weren't systematic child murder. The gradual decline had been occurring for decades, as Carthage became increasingly isolated from other Mediterranean civilizations. But the final collapse was sudden and complete. Unlike other civilizations that might decline over centuries while maintaining some continuity of culture and identity, Carthage was systematically eliminated with a thoroughness that was impressive even by Roman standards. The Romans didn't just conquer Carthage. They erased it, destroying the buildings, killing or enslaving the population, salting the earth, and even forbidding anyone from rebuilding on the site. Perhaps most symbolically, the final destruction included the deliberate demolition of the Tophet, where Roman soldiers reportedly spent days breaking apart thousands of urns containing the cremated remains of sacrificed children and scattering the ashes to ensure they couldn't be reassembled. This wasn't just military conquest. It was cultural exorcism. an attempt to eliminate not just the Carthaginians, but any trace of their practices that might inspire future civilizations to develop similar customs. The symbolic endpoints reveal how completely the Romans wanted to eliminate not just Carthage, but the very memory of what Carthage had represented. They reportedly forbade anyone from even speaking the name of the city for a period after its destruction, essentially trying to create a historical amnesia that would prevent future generations from learning about Carthaginian practices and potentially replicating them. It's like trying to solve the problem of serial killers by making it illegal to talk about murder. Technically, a response to the problem, but probably not the most effective approach. The analysis of causes reveals that Carthage's destruction was overdetermined. There were so many factors working against their survival that it's remarkable they lasted as long as they did, rather than surprising that they eventually collapsed. The internal problems included a religious system that demanded the systematic murder of the population most necessary for long-term survival, children, creating a civilization that was literally consuming its own future to appease gods who apparently weren't paying attention to the strategic situation. External pressures included the obvious diplomatic and military consequences of being the Mediterranean world's designated pariah state. But these external factors were largely consequences of internal choices rather than independent forces. The Romans didn't wake up one morning and decide to eliminate Carthage for no reason. They developed their anti-Carthaginian policies in response to centuries of Carthaginian practices that had made them intolerable neighbors. It's like wondering why nobody wants to hang out with you after you've spent years hosting parties that feature baby barbecues as the main entertainment. The role of individuals versus historical forces becomes complex when you consider that individual Carthaginian leaders had multiple opportunities to reform their practices, but consistently chose to intensify them instead. While broader historical forces certainly contributed to the conflict, individual decisions by Carthaginian religious and political leaders repeatedly chose paths that made compromise impossible and conflict inevitable. They had agency, and they used it to make catastrophically bad choices. What could have been done differently is obvious in retrospect, but was apparently unthinkable to contemporary Carthaginians. They could have gradually reformed their religious practices, eliminated child sacrifice, and developed alternative forms of spiritual expression that wouldn't have horrified their neighbors. Other civilizations had successfully transitioned away from human sacrifice without losing their cultural identity, proving that such changes were possible. The Carthaginians' failure to pursue this option suggests either remarkable cultural blindness or remarkable stubbornness, neither of which are attractive qualities in international relations. The question of inevitability versus contingency reveals that while some conflict between Carthage and Rome was probably inevitable due to their competition for Mediterranean dominance, the specific form that conflict took, total cultural elimination, justified by moral outrage, was largely a consequence of Carthaginian religious practices. A reformed Carthage that had abandoned child sacrifice might have been defeated militarily, but could have survived culturally, potentially maintaining some form of autonomous existence within the Roman sphere of influence like other conquered civilizations. Perhaps most significantly, the analysis reveals that Carthage ended not because they were militarily weak or economically disadvantaged, but because they had made themselves morally intolerable to the world they had to live in. They possessed sophisticated technology, accumulated wealth, and considerable military capabilities, but none of these advantages could compensate for having built their civilization on practices that made other civilizations view their elimination as a moral necessity rather than a regrettable consequence of political competition. They had essentially weaponized their own culture against themselves, creating a situation where their greatest religious devotion became their greatest strategic vulnerability. The immediate aftermath of Carthage's destruction was characterized by what can only be described as civilizational shock therapy for the entire Mediterranean world, as other cultures suddenly realized that certain practices could result in complete elimination rather than mere conquest or political subjugation. The immediate legacy wasn't just the absence of Carthage, but the presence of a new standard for international behavior that was enforced through the threat of total annihilation rather than traditional diplomatic or military pressure. Who stepped into the vacuum left by Carthage's elimination were primarily Roman administrators and colonists who had explicit instructions to ensure that nothing resembling Carthaginian culture ever developed in the region again. The Romans didn't just occupy former Carthaginian territories. They systematically replaced Carthaginian institutions, practices, and even architectural styles with Roman alternatives, creating what amounted to a cultural witness protection program for an entire region. It's like renovating a house by burning it down and building something completely different on the foundation. The short-term consequences included a Mediterranean-wide reassessment of religious practices as other civilizations suddenly became very concerned about whether any of their traditions might be interpreted as barbaric enough to justify Roman intervention. This created a kind of spiritual paranoia where communities would preemptively modify or eliminate any practices that might remind Roman officials of Carthaginian child sacrifice, leading to a homogenization of religious culture that prioritized Roman approval over local tradition. Contemporary reactions to Carthage's destruction were mixed, but generally supportive, revealing how successfully the Romans had framed the conflict as a moral crusade rather than a territorial conquest. Greek intellectuals wrote approvingly about the elimination of barbaric practices. Egyptian officials expressed relief that such disturbing neighbors had been removed, and even other Phoenician colonies publicly supported Roman actions while privately worrying about whether they might be next on the list for cultural elimination. Attempts at revival or continuation were systematically suppressed by Roman authorities who had learned from the Carthaginian example that allowing problematic cultural practices to persist even in modified forms could eventually require another round of total warfare. Former Carthaginian territories were populated with Roman colonists who had explicit instructions to report any signs of traditional Carthaginian religious observances, creating a surveillance state designed to prevent cultural resurrection. Perhaps most significantly, the immediate legacy included the establishment of what would become known as the Carthaginian precedent, the idea that civilizations could forfeit their right to exist by practicing customs that were deemed incompatible with civilized society. This precedent would be invoked repeatedly throughout Roman expansion to justify the complete cultural elimination of societies that resisted Roman standards of acceptable behavior, creating a template for cultural imperialism that would influence international relations for centuries and establish Rome as not just a military power, but as the arbiter of moral acceptability for the entire Mediterranean world. The legacy of Carthaginian child sacrifice shaped later developments in ways that would have horrified the original practitioners, as their systematic infanticide became the ancient world's premier example of how religious extremism could justify total civilizational elimination. The specific influences of the Carthaginian precedent can be traced through centuries of subsequent conflicts where moral outrage about cultural practices was used to legitimize conquest, cultural destruction, and what would now be recognized as genocide, creating a template for weaponizing humanitarian concerns that would be refined and reused by countless later empires. How later generations viewed the Carthaginian example reveals the development of a historical narrative that simplified the complex realities of ancient Mediterranean politics into a morality tale about good versus evil, civilized versus barbaric, and rational versus religious extremism. Roman historians like Livy and Pliny transformed the messy realities of imperial expansion into inspiring stories about moral crusades, creating a literary tradition that portrayed the destruction of Carthage as an unqualified triumph of civilization over barbarism rather than the more complicated reality of one violent society eliminating another violent society for a mixture of moral, economic, and strategic reasons. The myths versus realities that developed around Carthaginian practices included both exaggerations of their cruelty and underestimations of their sophistication, creating a distorted historical image that served the political needs of later empires better than it served the cause of historical accuracy. Roman propagandists emphasized the most horrific aspects of child sacrifice while downplaying Carthaginian achievements in trade, technology, and urban planning, creating a caricature of pure evil that made their destruction seem both necessary and praiseworthy. Why the Carthaginian example remained important to later civilizations becomes clear when you consider how useful it was as a justification for cultural imperialism and religious persecution. Medieval Christians used references to Carthaginian child sacrifice to justify crusades against Islamic civilizations. Early modern Europeans cited Carthaginian barbarism to legitimize the conquest and cultural destruction of indigenous American societies. And even modern authoritarian regimes have invoked the Carthaginian precedent to justify interventions against societies whose practices they find objectionable. The development of this historical legacy created what can only be described as a feedback loop of moral imperialism, where each generation of conquerors could point to the Carthaginian example as proof that some civilizations simply deserve to be eliminated for the good of humanity. This made the Carthaginian case not just a historical curiosity, but an active force in world history, as the memory of their practices continued to be used to justify violence and cultural destruction long after the last Carthaginian had died. Perhaps most perversely, the Carthaginian legacy influenced later developments by creating a historical expectation that moral crusades should end with total victory and complete cultural elimination rather than reform, negotiation, or coexistence. The Roman approach to Carthage established a precedent that dealing with morally objectionable practices required the complete destruction of the societies that practiced them, eliminating more moderate approaches that might have achieved humanitarian goals without requiring genocidal violence. This all-or-nothing approach to cultural conflict would echo through history whenever powerful civilizations encountered practices they found intolerable. The historical impact also included the development of increasingly sophisticated propaganda techniques for justifying cultural destruction, as later empires learned from the Roman example how to frame territorial expansion and resource acquisition as humanitarian intervention and moral necessity. The Carthaginian case became a masterclass in how to transform selfish imperial ambitions into righteous crusades against barbarism, providing a template that would be used repeatedly whenever empires needed moral justification for actions that were primarily motivated by power and greed. Today, we can see echoes of the Carthaginian situation in disturbing ways that reveal how little human nature has changed despite technological and social progress, as modern conflicts continue to feature the same basic patterns of moral justification for violence, cultural destruction disguised as humanitarian intervention, and the weaponization of genuine humanitarian concerns to serve political and economic interests. The specific parallels are uncomfortable enough to make modern observers squirm, especially when they realize how many contemporary conflicts follow the same essential script that led to Carthage's destruction. The most obvious modern examples include situations where powerful nations have used concerns about cultural practices to justify military intervention and regime change, often with results that are more devastating for the target populations than the original problems they were supposed to solve. The pattern of identifying genuinely problematic practices, amplifying them through media coverage, using them to justify military action, and then implementing solutions that cause more suffering than the original problems is depressingly familiar. To anyone who has studied recent international conflicts, what hasn't changed about human nature becomes apparent when you examine how modern societies still struggle with the same fundamental tensions between cultural tolerance and moral standards. That made the Carthaginian situation inevitable. Contemporary debates about cultural practices that conflict with human rights principles, whether involving treatment of women, religious minorities, or children, often feature the same inability to distinguish between practices that are merely different and practices that are genuinely harmful that characterized ancient Mediterranean politics. Similar patterns in different contexts appear in modern discussions about authoritarian regimes, religious extremism, and cultural practices that conflict with international human rights standards. The international community still struggles with questions about when cultural sovereignty should be respected and when humanitarian intervention becomes necessary, often reaching conclusions that are influenced more by political convenience and strategic interests than by consistent moral principles. It's like watching the same movie with different actors and better special effects. The parallels become especially uncomfortable when you consider how modern democratic societies have developed their own forms of moral rigidity and cultural imperialism that echo the Roman approach to Carthage. Contemporary Western societies often display the same combination of genuine moral concern and self-serving political calculation that characterized Roman attitudes toward Carthaginian child sacrifice, using legitimate humanitarian concerns to justify policies that serve broader strategic and economic interests. Perhaps most significantly, modern examples reveal how easily societies can develop blind spots about their own practices while maintaining moral outrage about other societies' behavior. The same countries that express horror at human rights violations abroad often maintain policies and institutions that cause significant suffering to vulnerable populations at home, demonstrating the same capacity for moral blindness that prevented Carthaginians from recognizing how their practices appeared to others. The modern world also features the same tendency toward binary thinking about cultural conflicts that made compromise impossible between Rome and Carthage. Contemporary international relations often reduce complex cultural and political disputes to simple questions of good versus evil, civilized versus barbaric, and progressive versus reactionary, eliminating the middle ground where negotiation and gradual reform might be possible. This creates situations where cultural differences can only be resolved through submission or elimination, just as in the ancient Mediterranean. Lessons for contemporary issues include the importance of maintaining the ability to see ourselves as others see us, the dangers of using legitimate moral concerns to justify disproportionate responses, and the need to distinguish between practices that are merely different and practices that are genuinely harmful. The Carthaginian example also demonstrates how quickly moral crusades can become indistinguishable from imperial expansion, and how societies that position themselves as arbiters of moral acceptability risk developing their own forms of extremism and blindness. Even now, the Carthaginian example influences multiple areas of contemporary life in ways that most people don't recognize, creating ongoing effects that extend far beyond academic historical study into practical questions about international relations, cultural diversity, and the limits of tolerance in pluralistic societies. The continuing influence appears in academic study through ongoing debates about cultural relativism, moral universalism, and the appropriate responses to cultural practices that conflict with contemporary human rights standards. Popular culture has absorbed the Carthaginian example as a shorthand for absolute evil and moral barbarism, with references to child sacrifice appearing regularly in films, literature, and political discourse as the ultimate example of practices that no civilized society should tolerate. This cultural absorption has created a kind of moral benchmark that influences how contemporary societies evaluate their own practices and those of others, often in ways that oversimplify complex moral and political questions. Political discourse continues to invoke the Carthaginian precedent whenever politicians want to justify harsh measures against societies or groups whose practices they find objectionable. The rhetoric of moral crusade, humanitarian intervention, and civilizational conflict that developed around the Carthaginian case remains a standard part of contemporary political language, though the specific targets and justifications have evolved with changing circumstances. Social movements on various sides of contemporary cultural conflicts use the Carthaginian example to support their positions, with some arguing that certain practices are so fundamentally wrong that they justify extreme responses, while others point to the dangers of moral absolutism and the tendency for humanitarian concerns to be weaponized for political purposes. The example has become a kind of historical Rorschach test, where different groups see confirmation of their own beliefs about tolerance, intervention, and cultural conflict. Why people still care about the Carthaginian example reflects its continuing relevance to fundamental questions about human nature, cultural diversity, and the appropriate limits of tolerance that remain unresolved, despite thousands of years of philosophical and political development. The case continues to influence contemporary thinking because it represents an extreme example of problems that persist in modified forms throughout human history, making it both a historical curiosity and a continuing source of insights about the challenges of living in a diverse world. Looking back across the centuries we've explored together, we've witnessed one of history's most disturbing examples of how sophisticated civilizations can develop practices that seem unthinkable to outsiders while remaining completely normal to those within the system. Our journey through Carthaginian child sacrifice has revealed major themes that extend far beyond ancient history into fundamental questions about human nature, cultural blindness, and the terrifying ease with which societies can normalize the abnormal when the right social, religious, and psychological pressures align. The key patterns that emerge throughout our exploration include the systematic normalization of horror through institutional processes, the development of religious and social frameworks that make questioning barbaric practices more dangerous than participating in them, and the creation of feedback loops where success reinforce the very behaviors that would ultimately doom the entire civilization. We've seen how individual psychology and social pressure combine to create systems where parents could genuinely love their children while simultaneously participating in ceremonies designed to murder them, demonstrating levels of cognitive dissonance that challenge our understanding of human psychological capacity. The most surprising discoveries along our journey included the revelation that Carthaginian child sacrifice wasn't the product of primitive barbarism but of sophisticated social engineering that created elaborate systems for managing systematic infanticide with bureaucratic efficiency. We discovered that the practice wasn't limited to desperate crisis situations but was integrated into normal religious and social life in ways that made it seem like a reasonable response to everyday challenges. Perhaps most shocking was learning how the international community of the time largely tolerated these practices for economic and political convenience until they became so extreme that ignoring them was no longer politically viable. How our understanding has evolved throughout this exploration reveals the complexity of judging historical practices and the dangers of both moral relativism and moral absolutism when evaluating cultural differences. We've learned that while cultural practices deserve respectful consideration, some behaviors cross lines that make coexistence impossible, and that societies can become so invested in their own traditions that they lose the ability to recognize when those traditions have become self-destructive. The Carthaginian example demonstrates how quickly moral blindness can develop and how difficult it becomes to change course once institutional momentum builds around problematic practices. The most important takeaways from our journey include understanding how ordinary people can become complicit in extraordinary evil through gradual normalization processes, recognizing the warning signs that indicate when cultural practices are becoming dangerously extreme, and appreciating the importance of maintaining external perspectives that can challenge internal assumptions before they become too entrenched to change. We've also learned about the dangers of using legitimate moral concerns to justify disproportionate responses, and how easily humanitarian intervention can become indistinguishable from imperial expansion when moral outrage is weaponized for political purposes. As we prepare to close this dark chapter of human history, there's one final story that encapsulates everything we've discussed while providing a haunting reminder of the human cost behind all. The historical analysis and cultural commentary. Archaeological evidence from the final days of Carthage reveals a scene that brings together all the themes we've explored. In a residential district near the harbor, excavators found the remains of a family who had apparently barricaded themselves in their home during the final Roman assault, choosing to die together rather than face capture or slavery. What makes this discovery particularly poignant is that among the family's possessions were the cremated remains of what appeared to be their own children, carefully preserved and decorated. Urns that suggested these had been sacrifice offerings from earlier ceremonies. The family had apparently kept the ashes of their sacrificed children as treasured religious artifacts, maintaining shrines in their home where they could honor the memory of offspring they had willingly offered to the gods. The archaeological evidence suggests they died while protecting these urns, indicating that even in their final moments, they remained committed to the religious practices that had defined their civilization. Why this story encapsulates the broader themes becomes clear when you consider how it reveals the complete moral inversion that had occurred in Carthaginian society, where parents could simultaneously love their children enough to die protecting their memory and participate in systems that murdered those same children for religious purposes. The family's devotion to preserving the ashes of their sacrificed children demonstrates the psychological complexity of people who were neither monsters nor victims, but ordinary humans trapped within extraordinary circumstances that had normalized the unthinkable. What this final scene reveals about everything we've discussed is how cultural systems can create situations where people act in ways that seem contradictory or impossible to outside observers, but make perfect sense within their own cultural framework. The family died protecting what they viewed as sacred relics that honored their children's sacrifice, while outside observers would see them as evidence of systematic child murder. Both perspectives are accurate within their respective contexts, demonstrating the fundamental incompatibility between different moral frameworks that made conflict inevitable. How this story connects to our broader exploration is through its demonstration of how individual human stories get lost within larger historical narratives about civilizational conflict and cultural destruction. The family in that house weren't abstract representatives of Carthaginian barbarism. They were real people who loved their children, honored their memory, and died defending what they believed was right, even though their beliefs had led them to participate in practices that most other societies found intolerable. The memorable final image this story provides is of parents dying while clutching urns containing the ashes of children they had helped to kill, creating a tableau that captures the tragic contradiction at the heart of Carthaginian civilization. It's a scene that defies easy moral judgment while demanding serious reflection about how ordinary people can become trapped within systems that destroy everything they naturally value. The family died as both perpetrators and victims of the same cultural system, demonstrating how historical villains and historical victims are often the same people viewed from different perspectives. This final story serves as a reminder that behind all our historical analysis and cultural commentary were real families making impossible choices within systems they hadn't created but couldn't escape, leaving us with the sobering recognition that moral clarity becomes much more complicated when applied to actual human beings rather than abstract historical forces. And so we reach the end of our journey through one of history's darkest chapters. Having explored how a sophisticated civilization could develop practices that seem unthinkable today while remaining completely normal to those who lived within that system, we've seen how moral blindness can develop gradually through institutional processes, how ordinary people can become complicit in extraordinary evil, and how societies can destroy themselves through stubborn adherence to practices that make them intolerable to the world they must live in. The Carthaginian example serves as both a historical curiosity and a continuing warning about the human capacity for self-destruction through moral extremism and cultural isolation. Their story reminds us that civilization is more fragile than we often assume, that moral progress is never guaranteed, and that the line between the civilized and the barbaric can be crossed more easily than we'd like to believe. As you reflect on this disturbing chapter of human history, perhaps the most important lesson is the need for humility about our own moral certainties and the importance of maintaining the ability to see ourselves as others see us. The Carthaginians weren't uniquely evil. They were humans like us who made choices that seemed reasonable within their own context, but appeared monstrous to outside observers. Thank you for joining me on this difficult journey through the shadows of human history. May we all learn from their example the importance of questioning our own assumptions before they lead us down paths we never intended to walk. Sleep well, and remember that understanding the darkness is often the first step toward choosing the light.